Chapter 9, Part 1 of The Evacuation of England by L.P. Gratacap. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Spectacle. It was 2 days later than the events narrated above that Leacraft and Thomson, with Miss Tobit between them, sat in a crowded window on Hammersmith Road, watching for the enormous procession that had been slowly winding through London, with offices and services, halts and functions, as the King sadly led the departure of the English people from the Mother of Nations. And the vast pageant approached. Down Kensington Road, its first glittering sallies were seen, the block of London police, a gorgeous cavalcade behind them of the peers of the realm, and in the immeasurable distance the shimmering parts that looked stationary and yet were coming on with ample speed. The blaring trumpets in the bands drew near, the street was cleared from curb to curb, the dense assemblage, covering stoop and roof, and leaning from every window, became silent. The reiterated thud of the falling feet was heard, and in an instant the marching host was passing beneath them. The police and the peers of the realm passed in silence, or with barely noticeable tokens of recognition. The peers presented a dazzling array, on superbly caparisoned horses, and in the regalia of their separate stations, with a bearing of unmistakable dignity, and possessing in a large measure the impress and gift of English manly beauty, they uttered the note of caste. Behind them came the marshalled church, a wonderful picture, choirs of boys, surpliced and gowned in open carriages, priests and bishops in their robes of office, with flying standards of chapel, church, or cathedral, golden lambs, crosses and crowns, figures and moths on white silk or ruby silk in wavering confusion, while hymns in wavering sopranos rose petulantly, or again with sustained vitality and strength. It appealed to the people strangely. They became very still, and faces contorted with sobs, or heads bowed to hide the unbidden tears for a few moments, drew a veil of gloom over the splendid show. After the church and the piers, a forest of equipages brought in view the marvellous display of the robed and crowned peeresses, and succeeding this shining cloud of matrons that gave the touch of tenderness, the atmosphere of feminine companionship and endurance, as if the mothers of England responded in this untoward hour with an embracing sympathy. After them came the King's household, and the King, with outriders, equerries, and panoplied footmen, a miracle of ostentatious and ceremonial colour. His equipage was drawn by 10 jet-black stallions, with diapers of the King's colours on their backs, and a line of ancient guardsmen with pikes in their hands, hedging them in, and a footman in sparkling white at the head of each horse. The King was himself robed in the gowns of his high estate, and was uncovered, the crown resting on a cushion in front of him. A cheer rent the air. Unfurled flags and fluttering handkerchiefs turned a sea of faces into an ocean of white and red pennants. The King gravely acknowledged the salute and bowed to right and left. He was alone. The Queen had been enthroned among the peeresses. After the King came the Mayor of London, and with all the antiquated grandeur of his office, coach, beefeaters and all, and the people settled back again to their lunches, which had been interrupted by the King. Then came the troops. The display was exhaustive. It was conceived upon a scale of imperial magnificence, and it appealed in the succession of its gorgeous units to the historic sense, to that divine purpose of continuity which every Englishman instinctively appropriates to his race and nation. It represented the chronological development of the English army. As its sonorous length defiled before Leacraft, he saw an objective symbol, nay, the corporeal fact of England's growing power. Regiment after regiment made a pictorial calendar from 1660 to 1900, and to the informed mind, what a vista of martial glory! What a presentation of advance and retreat over the trackless wastes of the world they made! It was a trampling chronicle of woe and fame, shame and satisfaction. It embodied the progress of ideas, the clash of political tendencies, the spreading domination of English rule. It was a panorama of battles, the tide of victory, the ebbing terrors of defeat. It reflected the pages of political designs, political subterfuge, political confusion. The music that swelled from its ranks now sent the long waves of its solemn processional melody through the thrilled spectators, now in limpid folk songs, quivering delightfully in their ears, and now again summoned them to their feet with the stately and pious invocation of the nation's hymn. The scarlet uniforms of the 1st Life Guards passed, and Maastricht, Boyne, the Peninsular, and Waterloo flashed in view. The regiment which was raised in Holland by King Charles II, and was composed of 80 gentlemen whose sobriquet of the Cheeses, along with other Life Guards, had been acquired from the contemptuous refusal of their veterans to serve in them when remodelled, because they were no longer composed of gentlemen, but of cheesemongers. Again, the 2nd Life Guards revived the stained memory of the Stuarts, its own exile in the Netherlands, its return with the Restoration, and its sea-green facings, pleasantly restored for a moment the face of the injured Queen Caroline. Here were the Royal Horse Guards that inherited, or at least might claim, the virtues of the Parliamentary Army, which fought with dogmas at the ends of their pike staffs and convictions in their hearts. Now passed the 1st Dragoon Guards that carried on its proud records the Battle of the Boyne in 1690, Ouenard in 1708, Malplaquet in 1709, Fontenoy in 1745, Waterloo in 1815, and Pekin in 1860, though to Leacraft's sensitive mind the last was an inscription of disgrace. The beating hoofs of the Queen's bays, the 2nd Dragoon Guards, hurried the reminiscent admirer back to Lucknow and the Indian Mutiny. The nodding plumes of the Prince of Wales with the rising sun, and the Red Dragon which came in view with the 3rd Dragoon Guards, unfailingly recalled to the custodians of English military renown that the regiment captured the standard and kettle drums of the Bavarian Guards at the Battle of Ramillies. Trampling on the heels of their horses, the lordly Blue Horse defiled past, and the 5th Dragoon Guards, which supported the vital legend Vestigia Nulla Retrorsum, and which captured 4 standards at the Battle of Blenheim. Still the endless lines advanced, wavered, stood still, and again with rattling and shivering harness passed. Now it was the 2nd Dragoons, the Scotch Greys, raised in Scotland, and older than any other dragoons in the British Army, that started the furious applause, an ovation not unintelligently bestowed, for it was they who captured the colours of the French at Ramillies, and their standards at Dettingen. Now it was the Black Dragoons, the 6th, on its glistening horses, once part of the Inniskilling forces, and still bearing as its crest the castle of Inniskilling. Now the 8th Hussars, whose Protestant fealty had made their founders defenders of William of Orange at the Battle of the Boyne, and who, with signal power, captured 44 stands of colours and 72 guns at the Battle of Les Soieries. Now the 15th Hussars, who bore upon their helmets the dazzling inscription, 5 battalions of French defeated and taken by this regiment with their colours, and 9 pieces of cannon at Emsdorf, 16th of July, 1760. Swelling hearts greeted the Grenadier Guards, rich in the legacy of the fame of the defeated French Imperial Guards. Here were the Dublin Fusiliers, the Green Linnets, the Diehards, the East Surreys, the West Yorks and Devons, who had been part of that indiscriminate blunder and glory, the Boer War. And now the infantry in closing ranks unrolled the endless phalanxes. Where regiments as entire units were absent, companies took their places, and English cheers saluted their swinging standards. The 35th, which took the Royal Roussillon French Grenadiers at the Battle of Quebec, the 34th, which impregnably covered the retreat from Fontenoy, the 39th, which defended Gibraltar in 1780 and captured the insurgents' guns and standards at Maharajpur in 1843, along with the 40th, the 42nd, with the red heckle in its bonnets, to commemorate its capture of the French standards of the Invincible Legion in 1801, as well as for its distinguished ardour in the Battle of Guildermalsen in 1795, and the little Fighting Toms, stirred the crowds, and even to those who regarded the pageant with glances of bitterness, as the hollow mask of a cruel abdication, even to their glassy stare, this epic review brought a momentary gleam of gratitude and pride. Here was the 46th, whose colonel, with the English nonchalance which always wins so enduring a regard with Englishmen, in spite of a kind of artifice of mere stubbornness in it, preached a sermon to his men under a heavy fire about the Lacedaemonians and their discipline, and which, at least to an American, awoke only hateful memories. And here the 50th, the blind half-hundred who fought with damaged eyes in Egypt, and who shone resplendent with courage and gallant sacrifice at Wimmera. Ah, and here was the 57th, the Diehards, which had 30 bullets through the king's colours, and only one officer out of 24, and 168 men out of 584 left standing at Albuera. The people shouted and stormed. An avalanche of flags suddenly sprang up over the walled street, and at points showers of flowers and bags of fruit descended in a tornado of delight. Surely if Englishmen had such blood in them, the nation would yet live. Here were the men from India, the regiments of the 73rd, the 74th, wearing the badge of the elephant, the 76th, too, that unfurled its victorious pennants at the Battle of Les Soieries, and the 77th and 78th, and on, straight in the line, brave squadrons, whose elusive recognition in a numeral connoted glorious deeds, defiant strength, the prodigal powers of the brave. The thundering salutations drowned the rollicking music of "Clear the Way," the cry at Borosso, which with fife and drum announced the approach of the 87th, the Prince of Wales' own Irish, and the 88th, the Connaught Rangers, whose more loving sobriquet was the Devil's Own Connaught Boys, from its gallantry in action and its irregularities in quarters. Uniform and vanity with reciprocal enhancement made the Argyllshire Highlanders and the Gordon Highlanders and the Sutherland Highlanders an envious spectacle to manly youth, a vision of ingratiating heroes to feminine beauty. Again India sprang back to memory, perhaps not without, to souls of Leocraft's fibre, inflicting some stinging stabs of remorse, when the 100-foot, the 102nd foot, the Lambs, the 103rd foot, the Old Tufts, the 104th foot, and 7th and 8th and 9th marched past, with ears shattering dim in resplendent waves of colour, and expressing the English temperament of reserved force and intelligent determination, with, to the more analytical observer, a suggestion of brutal power in their sturdy and inelastic tramp. And then came the people of the earth. From the ends of the world they came, the wild, the exotic, the uncouth, the suave and treacherous, the mystic, the benign, the terrible, in all garbs, in vestures of wool and silk and cotton, in no small numbers, without much vesture. It was a web of hues, a carpet of figures and dyes, a lithe and sinuous and portentous living worm, each zone of its immense length, as it swayed and twisted and halted, and then slipped on with ludicrous indecision and disorder, made up of races, ethnic blotches or flowers from the round, prolific globe. The army had been history. The procession now became psychological, a review of temperaments, endowments, climates, proclivities, and talents. Nay, it wore the aspect of a zoological medley, a vast menagerie of animal products, that with growl and scream, trumpetings or fluttering wings, gave to the congeries of men and women who walked among them, or with them, the sentiment and resemblance of the parade of the beasts before Adam. As if with England's dislodgment, the shaken countries of the earth emptied out their populations in her wake, disturbed in all their resting places by her calamity, spilled from their hidden corners into the shining light of day, and bringing with them the animals of the fields and the birds of the air. And the air itself was cruelly brilliant. The severity of outlines, the sharp shadows, the nipping frostiness in the shades where the sun was not found, told the weary story that England had lost her climate and was swept back in a normal alignment with the cold and feeble countries of the pole. What is this odd group, accentuated in the midst of all this confusion of types by a more bizarre strangeness? The quizzical fatuity and simpering idiocy of devotion, grinning shikaris from the Tibet with prayer wheels, from the lofty valleys of Baltistan and Ladakh, from Kargil and Malba Chamba, incredible children from the east with their rotating brass wheels, with a woman or so proudly walking among them, carrying a burden of wealth in her turquoise and carnelian-encrusted barrack bound round her head and terminating in a black knotted fringe behind her neck. And straggling on their tracks come the Malays from Penang and Dindings, from Malacca and Singapore, the small brown men, enduring, bright-eyed, straight black-haired, in jackets and trousers and sarongs, the tartan skirt fastened around the waist and reaching to the knee, and with a Rajah sprinkled among them with a yellow umbrella over him, a dandy nonchalance printing his sleek cheek with dimples. And India, the nursery of religions, of dreams, of talking and sleeping and famishing men, followed, and for an instant Leacraft thought of Kim's journey from Umballa through Kalka, and the Pinjore Gardens nearby up to Simla, which Kipling told. He thought on the flush of the morning laid along the distant snows, the branched cacti, tier upon tier the stony hillsides, the voices of 1,000 water channels, the chatter of monkeys, the solemn deodars, climbing one after another with down-drooped branches, the vista of the plains rolled far out beneath them, the incessant twanging of the tonga horns and the wild rush of the led horses, the halt for prayers, the evening conference by the halting places when camels and bullocks chewed solemnly together. He closed his eyes in a reverie, and the next opened them upon the very thing. Here were the bullocks, the monkeys, the camels. Here, too, came the hulking elephants, Dravidians from the southern peninsula in shawls, the hill tribes in coats, the high-caste Hindus in skirts and turbans, Mussulmen from Kashmir, and a few Indian princes with their suites in a coruscation of gemstones, made up a train of spectacles that drew the eager crowds together, almost to the obliteration of the narrow string of exotics that, a little shabbily, shuffled along between them, with, however, the princes on horseback or swung in state in palanquins. End of Chapter 9, Part 1. Chapter 9, Part 2 of The Evacuation of England by L.P. Gratacap. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. But here came Egypt, bearing her witness of the universality of that power which, with her at least, had seemed to play the part of a benevolent trustee and guide. No longer the impetuous crowds crushed the line of march. Behind the blaring band that now approached rode Lord Kitchener, Sirdar of the Egyptian army, who had resumed his ancient post, and from an overwrought sentiment for exoneration announced his desire to remain there, and thus efface the irreconcilable differences which had caused Lord Curzon's retirement from India. It was a magnanimous action, and had deeply ingratiated this popular hero in the favour of the nation. Lord Kitchener, with his staff, preceded in military stateliness, and with smart precision, 5 regiments or groups of Egyptian soldiers. These were combined or selected so as to make a bouquet of colours, but essentially businesslike also in their serious regularity, a demeanour fortified to the point of affectation by the plaudits and unconcealed admiration of the hosts of people on the streets, and protruding from every point above them. There were Arab lancers in light blue uniforms, almost too delicate in tone for daily travel, the bodies of the Camel Corps, with the blackest type of men in the Sudanese infantry regiments, assimilating to the soil of the desert in the colour of their khaki costume, and then other details of the military organisation, gleaming in immaculate white trousers and coats. It was unmistakably effective, and it imparted a moral strength to this illimitable advertisement of physical power. It recalled the campaigns of Khartoum and Omdurman, and memorialized that time-worn boast of the English rehabilitation of Egypt, a fact certainly, but not to be distinguished as a very incredible achievement. The spectacle closed with Zulus and Hottentots, the Bushmen of Australia, some dejected New Zealanders, and a picturesque assortment of Jamaican Negroes, who tramped along with amusement in their staring eyes, and a raggedness of deportment reflecting the wasteful and careless way of the tropics. Nor were there wanting Greeks from Cyprus, and at the last the loyalty of the colonies was splendidly emphasized. Canada, Australia, South Africa, New Zealand, Natal, Bermuda, the Bahamas contributed a final burst of patriotic zeal, and seemed to open the wide earth to their kindred in the English island for home-making and re-establishment. Nor was the show of devotion fortuitous or hollow. It was sincere. It represented a sudden rapprochement, an instantaneous and valid impulse of sympathy and support. Nothing had ever happened in the history of the English people which had had so vital an influence in stimulating unity among the English themselves, which so peremptorily flung them into each other's arms, and in a great peril summoned to the surface the inextinguishable claims of blood, ancestry, tradition, instincts, and pride, advancing them to a solidarity never before realized. Its effects were very apparent. The pictures of hope, lit up by the imaginative flamings of ambition, almost at times, at this dread moment, gave to the future, in the new habitations awaiting them, an unexpected salubrity and beauty. The English leaders dreamed of new achievements, a new literature, a greatness vastly exceeding all their historic records. 3 days after the parade which Leacraft saw so magniloquently evolved in the streets of London at Tilbury, the king left English soil to transplant the symbols and the functions of the English government to Australia, and to begin the new experiment. The hills, the fields, the shores were all too contracted to hold the army and the people, gathered in one sublime throb of loyalty and affection to witness the inexpressible event. The king, wearing the uniform of a field marshal, issued from a royal tent, and with uncovered head moved towards the shore where his barge was moored. The moment was statuesque. The immeasurable multitude, with a wave of heartbreaking emotion, uncovered. The national hymn, played by a string and wind orchestra of 400 pieces, pierced the air with its magnificent undulation of melody, and a selected chorus led the engulfing tide of song. Amid the surges of vocal outpouring, the parks of artillery belched their resounding salutes. The lines of war vessels, with their crews at attention, returned the iron-throated call, and the king, standing below the sweeping oars, turned for an instant towards the shore, and then regained his first posture of immovable fixture upon the pregnable sides of the dreadnought, whither each stroke of those fateful oarsmen was swiftly sending him. The suspense was insupportable. The poignant, crushing terror of it all, the incredible predicament of a nation bodily leaving its birthplace, stunned the crowds, and in silence, with 1,000 varying episodes throughout its interminable acres, the populace stood dumb as the unresponsive rock, apparently as apathetic as the herding cows. Then, at sunfall, the dreadnought, followed by an escort of cruisers, heavily churned the waters, and passed down the Thames from its mouth into the Channel, and so on to the open sea. And with it went the concentrated expression of the idea of the English Empire, the King. How strangely immobile is nature, a race which had covered its literary vestures with the garlands of poetry, wrought from the imagery in nature's picture book, which had spent its brain and industry in winning for nature new devotees and new sacrifices of praises and idolatry, which had enthroned among its chiefest charms its surrender to the control of nature in this hour of torturing doubt. Disenthronement and eviction won no sign of recognition. The day closed brightly. The sun went down in a sky of unchecked splendor, and the moon-illuminated night bathed the ancient bastions of Tilbury with an argent sheen. The terrible event found no reflection in the august calmness and serenity of nature. Its withers were unwrung. Enveloped in the processes of decay and change, the lapse of a kingdom was but a paltry contribution to the chronicle of destroyed continents and shattered worlds. There was no contact between its mechanism and the obliteration of a sentiment, or an idea, or moral regime. Nothing short of a change in atmospheric pressure would bring tears to its face, or agony in its deportment. And what, in any case, was this desertion of a land, the removal of a people? It was subordinated to fluctuations of an oceanic river, to the up and down shiverings of the crust of the earth. It was a part of the huge drama, part of the inlaid order of things, as determined at creation, when the ways and means of shaping the world and all things in it were inaugurated. Why should the disappearance of a condition shock a system of disappearances and appearances, which is another name for the unceasing orbit of revolutions in the face of the earth, and which is nature? An individual counts for nothing in the lapse of 24 hours, gone or come. Why, in the eons gone and the eons yet to come, should the migration of a people, or the emptying of a vestige of the earth's surface, merit notice? And so the elements did not hasten to weep or storm, or furiously proclaim their commiseration, and the whispering calls of the half-revived summer from pond and wood and meadow retained their old-time sweetness. Thus it happened, but from the mouth of men and women, and prompted deeply in their yearning soul, rose clouds of prayers that night for the safety of the king, and ever and anon, as troops marched over the roads in the cold summer night, the hymn, "Lord of the wave and deep, save those at sea, their path upon the ocean keep, and let them see thy hand each passing day, thy ministry of peace," was played with bewitching plaintiveness. Men and women stopped and sang it aloud as the regiments went by, and sometimes a company of troopers added with resounding vigour their sonorous refrain. The Prime Minister and Mr. Birrell and Mr. Asquith, who had been associated in 1906 in the famous deadlock between the Commons and the House of Lords over the Educational Bill, prepared on the departure of the King a statement which really was a programme of evacuation. It contemplated a progressive transference of the people from England, a slowly consummated shrinkage of the business facilities and the moderated outflow of capital to the new centres of English activity. In this way some check would ensue to the frightful fall in the land values and rentals, apart from the practical consideration of the physical impossibility of at once removing 40 millions of people. The government had usurped unusual powers in the creation of a committee of direction, which, by a house-to-house canvass, an exhaustive survey of all titles, and a comparative estimate of the hardship imposed by emigration to different families, with immense labour, had prepared an itemized list of departure of the families of London. This plan had been copied in the large cities of the kingdom, and a cooperative scheme framed, which comprised a detailed prescription of the time of sailing and the places of settlement for all persons listed. These lists were commonly referred to as the Doomsday Rolls. The scope of the committee's power was comprehensive. It prohibited to individuals and to societies, federations and unions, independent action without explicit conference with the committee. It proved to be a most helpful device, and lessened to the lowest possible percentage of hardship the suffering of the people. Leacraft and his new friends freed themselves from the jurisdiction of the committee by announcing their intention to go to America, and upon ample evidence of their ability to do so and their independent financial standing. It was fully understood that the evacuation was to be a sustained, gradual movement, with, however, an irreversible determination to make it finally complete. It was not believed that England had become utterly uninhabitable, or that some vestiges of its former occupation might not still be maintained. A part of the plan of evacuation involved an affectionate care of its greater monuments of architecture, if possible, though the fierceness of the winter winds augured unhappily for the success of this design. A regency of love, at any rate, was to be established, and as many links as possible of connection, sentimental and real, were to be left unbroken. And Edinburgh? Thompson had woefully noted every day the scanty paragraphs which entered the papers, and which gave brief intimations of the devastating and continuous storms which, through the winter, swept over Scotland. As if in order that the impending changes might be most forcibly realized, and the loss of time averted from too leniently interpreting the enormous seasonal metamorphosis going on, Nature had exhausted her power in developing disaster. Terrific gales had lashed the rocky coasts. Fierce, insatiable blizzards had devouringly raged in the interior, and the pitiless and untired skies had emptied avalanches of snow upon the southern counties of Scotland. Edinburgh became a storm centre. With whirling inconstancy the storms beat upon the doomed city from the east and west. Buildings were almost buried in the banked-up and superimposed drifts. Crested ranges were in the streets, and palisades of snow, tortured into fantastic shapes, towered over the outer eminences, fed from the blinding torrents of flakes driven off from the Pentland Hills and the Salisbury Crags. These summits alone, in the whitened waste, lifted their scraped crowns to the thickened skies. Edinburgh had become a city of the Frost King, and his slumbering regions bivouacked on and around it, except when aroused to riotous commotions by the sudden descent of the whistling armies of the wind. These details were rather incoherently reported as the spring advanced, and an occasional survivor from the north made his way out of the beleaguered capital. When the spring had fairly ripened into summer, an energetic effort was made to reach Edinburgh, and it succeeded. Scotland at that time became inundated, and though the enormous accumulations of snow refused at once to surrender their blockade, They were so deeply broached and undermined that the North British line pushed a train forward to the edge of the city, though unable to reach its depot in the heart of the city by reason of the hammered wedge of snow which it encountered under the castle's cliffs. After cutting their way out to the Lothian road, the explorers began investigations and were horror-stricken to find that immense conflagration had broken out, destroying great sections of the city which owed its partial survival to the masses of invading snow. These fires had started in the houses occupied by the domestic bandits, who had seized the finest residences, provisioned them from the stores, and surrendered themselves to an orgy of rapine and indulgence, by which their own fears were stifled through the excesses of their drunken dissipation. Hundreds of these unfortunates had perished in the flames their recklessness had invoked. The picture of the noble and beautiful city was shocking. The fires had made inroads upon the attractive Prince's Street, and in the portions west of the Caledonian Station towards the Donaldson Hospital, gaping openings and swept acres revealed the unchecked fury of the flames. While it was probable that the city might, with a return of auspicious conditions, resume some of its old beauty, it was also too plain that the veto of nature had been indelibly written across all such plans. Glaciers had already begun their formation in the highlands, and the incipient development of an ice age was forcibly proclaimed on every hand. The logic of events was unanswerable. The United Kingdom, throughout all its parts, must participate again in the benighted life of Labrador and Siberia. And Europe, throughout its borders, felt the poignant exasperation of the Arctic goad. It trembled with a new apprehension. The touch of those icy fingers stretched out in myriad lines of approach, swarming like wavering steel points in thick onslaught from the crowded skies, made it suddenly anxious. It corrected its habits. It took counsel of piety and played with beseeching care its pretty role of devotee. Its ridiculous and wicked society, with futile haste, filled the churches, and tried to forget its inherited cruelty, and even turned with an unexpected solicitude to the consideration of improving in some sure way the state of the untitled majority. Its scientific men rushed into congresses and explored their textbooks, and read and reread hopeless papers on the why and how of it, but being unable to invent another Gulf Stream, retired into dismal prognostications of a returning ice age. In fact, deluded as scientific men often are by language, they embraced the thought of a returning ice cap, which would successfully force its way from the Baltic to the Mediterranean. They nervously began measurements of the alpine glaciers, took temperatures, wandered up in the higher regions of the atmosphere in balloons, sounded the floor of the ocean, established meteorological stations everywhere, and became so excited and convinced that they were happily on hand at a critical geological juncture that they succeeded in supplying a technical ground for panic. The statesmen and economists were more useful. They estimated the results of any continued lowering of the temperatures, the effects of climatic alterations on life and production, especially in grain, and found that the southern countries of Europe were in some danger, and the northern countries very really threatened with a commercial overthrow, as England had been. They, too, turned to the colonies of their respective countries for refuge. It looked as if the bursting receptacles of European culture were about to explode and scatter over the ends of the world the germinal seeds of its civilization. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of The Evacuation of England by L.P. Gratacap. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Addendum. Histories leave oppressive legacies behind them. They may furnish subjects for art and literature and poetry, but as in family inheritance, they burden posterity with considerable rubbish. Society does not quickly free itself from superstition, nor from its habits of thinking or of doing things. Even when they become anachronisms, we are loath to part from them, because to our own detriment we are fond of them. America has started fresh and runs on the road of opportunity, while other nations must hobble and limp as best they can, with the clogs of old usage and prejudice hanging on their feet. It was the voice of our friend Leacraft, and he was standing on a broad piazza built at the rear of a spacious villa on the topmost slopes of Staten Island in the harbour of New York City, looking at the motionless ocean far beyond the fringe of land immediately before him, flushed by the setting sun. That luminary, with glorious opulence, had painted the sky a seething carmine in the west, and imparted its most delicate reminders of the morn to the eastern arches of the heavens that hung above the sea. The picture was superbly satisfying. There was enough detail in the landscape, enough isolation of house and wood and field, of moor and strand, and not too much. The oncoming twilight softly blended these nearer things, yet left them palpable. But the day still flung its garlands of illumination over the broad skies, and the sensitive surfaces of the water with lavish sympathy repeated on its face the smiles of the blending zenith. And on either side of Leacraft stood Miss Tobit and Mr. Thompson, and the month was June, and the year narrated. Before we satisfy our curiosity more closely as to their relation, or note those changes which 5 years, however kindly inclined, must leave behind them, let us follow this conversation, which of itself, 1915, 5 years after all the happenings previously, may unroll some curtains of the past. "Well," it was Thompson who was now speaking, "then I suppose you are not willing to quarrel with the material revolution we have been through, because all that has come between the present and the past, like the sundering of Damocles' sword, has saved us from the necessity of denuding ourselves of the old things, turning us loose in a fresh field, where we may play high-jinks with all we once venerated, and where we may end by despising ourselves for the very liberties you seem anxious for us to indulge in." Leacraft motioned to the chairs, and the three sat down in the same order as they stood. The place obviously was Leacraft's, or he exercised some sort of control over it, and it was Miss Tobit's voice which next took up the thread of talk. It was noticeable that Leacraft turned eagerly and looked at her, though his earnest face betrayed no symptoms of possession in truth. A contemplative sadness for a moment rested on his features, vanishing even with its dawn. "Why give up old things? Why change and change and change? You call it progress. Is it anything but going around in a circle? You'll come back to the very things you now reject, and some centuries hence the world will try the old experiments of feudalism and chivalry, and kings by divine right will be as popular as elected presidents. Indeed, people may care some day as much as ever to say their prayers and go to church." Both Leacraft and Thompson laughed, but it was Leacraft who retorted, and he leaned far back in the Morris chair, his eyes bent upon the visionary ring of the horizon, now webbed with bluescent shades. "I think there will be no returns, Mrs. Thompson." Ah, then Leacraft had lost again. "No merry-go-round. Our path, the path of humanity, is on and on and on, not always straight, not always level, and never final in its destinations. It was a physical chasm that separated the first colonies of this land from Europe. They brought with them traditions, customs, though luckily not of a very silly sort, but the lack of continuity with the whole antecedent history of England practically destroyed that history for them, and they began in untrammelled freedom to think for themselves and determine the essence of manhood, of worth, of liberty, of faith, of brotherhood, and their thinking throve upon nothing so much as the contemplation of the as yet humanly speaking, unused world about them. And the vicissitudes of living, the peril, the undiminished levy made by necessity upon their inventiveness, their industry, their courage, expelled the remaining vestiges of fealty to humbug, the pretense of class, the arrogance of office. They had wrested a living from nature, under circumstances of unabashed familiarity with the cruelty of the savage, the obduracy of climate, and the grudging responses of a sterile soil, and they estimated worth by the hardihood of men who worked. An American essayist has pointed out the emphasis laid by the northern, the Teutonic races upon individual liberty. He says something like this: "The Germanic race has been distinguished at all ages for its political capacity and the possession of vigorous institutions of self-government. That there grew up among the nations of this race a well-ordered system of government based upon the right of the individual. And why was this? Because they knew of the hardships of living, and the fibre of liberty-loving natures were formed under the kneading strands of perpetual conflict." James McKinnon has pointed out the same thing in his History of Modern Liberty. Arbitrary and selfish rule was most quickly crushed in Central Europe. No, we shall not return to the old follies, because we shall not be permitted to return, because struggle with nature will never cease. "Russia has been a cold country," answered Thomson, "and if the gauge of liberty is coldness, we should expect to have seen the fruits of popular government ripening, if you will permit the paradox, in its zero atmospheres. Or if wildness and natural enemies, those that make housekeeping difficult, and a man's skin a precious abode for his soul, why have not the Negroes of Africa won over the images of rhetoric which have been wasted upon Greece and Rome, both, by the by, hot countries? Rome and Greece never knew what liberty was in the modern sense. Both were types of class government. Before Christianity there could be no ideal of freedom in its holiest meanings. As for Russia, the germs of liberty are yet buried there, but it is understood an accident has put the autocracy in power, and like all beneficiaries of a system, its members fight for their living. Besides, Russia has not left off its barbarism, but nothing under heaven will keep her from being free. As to the Negro, he lies too far back, too near to the origins, and in any case the dangers of the jungle are met by craft rather than by consecutive exertion and daring. You regret that our new growth in the Pacific, the Australian England, has not put on the features of a republic instead of preserving the heritage of the kingly and royal class institutions under which the old England flourished. Do you think that nations can safely try experiments, like children playing games, or chemists mixing solutions, which, in the latter case, may at any moment blow their heads off? I think not. I think, Leacraft slowly replied, while Agnes Ethel Tobit, she who had become inferentially the wife of the handsome Thomson, arose and, walking to her husband's side, leaned over the back of his chair, thus looking down upon the speaker, who had turned towards Thomson, as if her movement was dictated by a desire to hear his friend more distinctly. I think that the finest, the most inspiring, yes, the most delicate and subtle virtues flourish in a republic, such as this Republic of the United States is. I confess I am in love with it. I love its people. They are superbly human and humanly noble. The American gentleman, and he lives on no particular and restricted level, you find him among the firemen, the policemen, the clerks, the fathers of families. This unique man is always gracious, delightful, unerringly just. I believe that these traits develop most naturally under the dispensations of equality, reasonably understood. I think the most fruitful national life ensues when a nation stands fundamentally in its government and in its social conceptions for common sense standards and an unqualified acceptance of the principles of personal freedom. I like these Americans. To me, their ardor, their naturalness, their hearty friendship, their generous self-forgetfulness, and a certain differential amusement at the foibles of less emancipated cultures is fascinating. Of course, there are stupid rich Americans, dressed in the most obnoxious livery of affectation and imitation, men and women who have treacherous tendencies in their feelings and desires, willing always to kick their own country and willing to leave it, but never willing to relinquish the luxuries its prosperity has enabled them to enjoy. There are also hateful middle-class Americans who deteriorate the impressions made by the best aspects of the American heart and mind. But the substance and the spirit of American life, however much disguised or from momentary and economic reasons obscured, is to me the most palatable. It is palpably the best life now shown on the world. It is the most energizing, the most alert, and it carries the power of enormous assimilation because it is built on the essence of manhood, the respect for the rights of others. I know what is in your thoughts and on the point of your tongue. You would ask, how about the Chinaman, the Negro, and the Japanese, perhaps? That is a long question and has nothing to do with my contention, for in a nutshell, respect for others' rights does not involve respect for others' habits, and generous as the Americans are, they are not so stupid as to wish to imperil for an unnecessary sentiment the hard-gained benefits of their own national experiment. They have already leavened the whole earth. It's not to be expected that they digest all of its rubbish as well. Let the rest of the world do something for itself and clean its own social sloughs by a little more admixture of freedom and sympathy. All this may seem to you intensely disagreeable, perhaps a little disloyal, but you wrong me. If I might answer your question without more evasion, I would peremptorily declare that I hoped that the New England in Australia would put on the lineaments, nay, incorporate the very breath and body of this land. I know it has not. Possibly it could not. Possibly pernicious and selfish instrumentalities have made it impossible. Pardon my intractable enthusiasm, but do not mistrust my heart. It is always England's. The night is too calm, too beautiful to disgrace it with wrangling. Let us tell the story of the last years to each other. Mine is a short one and can come last. But yours? Well, I know some of it, and Leacraft, without constraint or any show of vacillating envy, smiled up in the face of the pretty woman who looked down at him, and deeply that woman's heart honoured him for his magnanimous courage. There was a pause for an instant, and then Thompson began. He rose from his chair, and walking to the railing of the piazza, sat on it, half turned to the paling east, half towards Leacraft, and told the story of the transplanted English nation. That story can be told in more exacting phraseology than the colloquial method permits, and until his narrative becomes more personal, let us authentically review the events he rehearsed and which form a unique historic episode. With the departure of the king from the shores of England, the actual evacuation of the island began, and the means and ways of transferring the people previously thought out were carefully applied. The moment the king and Parliament arrived in Australia, a predicament arose. The king was recognized as king, functional in Australia and in England, functional anywhere the English control was established. But the Parliament of England, as the highest law-giving legislature of the realm, did it supersede the regional legislation of Australia? Was the autonomic power of the provinces of Australia obliterated with the arrival of the supreme legislative body of the British Empire? There was one broad, obvious proposition, the remedy to all doubt, collision, and ambiguity was to resume in Australia the exact conditions which had vanished in England, and now naturally sought a restatement and erection in the land the King and Parliament had reached. And this was generally accepted. There was a cordial and almost precipitate display of adhesion to the new plan. It destroyed the independent existence of the various sections of Australia and made the continental island a unit under the control of the Parliament, just as England had been. The enthusiasm which greeted this solution was adequate and convincing. It gave renewed hope to the patriotic and loyal souls who prayed and worked for the reproduction of the England they had left. The King himself responded to this burst of practical allegiance with a wise and fervent expression of affection and thankfulness. It was a gem of deliberate composition, and was well received. Meetings of endorsement and proclamations of ratification were made everywhere, and in the tumult of acclamation it escaped notice that a formidable opposition had become organized for forcible resistance to the whole scheme. This was overawed or suppressed, not without a show of force, in which Thomson had been himself engaged, and which brought about some adventures around the region at Mount Harwick in New South Wales. Thomson, after the conclusion had been reached that his own and Miss Tobit's families should follow the stream of people going to Australia, rather than was at first intended to coincide with Leacraft's wishes for them all to visit America, had sought employment in the government service among those to whom had been entrusted the regulation of this colossal emigration. He was therefore well acquainted with its various phases and results. When the King and Parliament left England, over 2 millions had preceded them, being, naturally, those who accepted the situation and who, besides, were not specifically limited for their support to investments at home. They went everywhere, many to the continent, many to India, perhaps half to America, which grew more and more before the eyes of the people as the most natural, most desirable, the most friendly home. A large number strayed to Africa, and yet others sought the expanding possibilities of South America. Englishmen had acquired such extended interests, drew so largely upon the resources of the entire world for their support, that now in a way they found natural business refuges all over its varied surface. It was a happy consequence of the constraining littleness of their own island. The financial question was the real difficulty, apart from the harsh bereavement and hardship of the divorce from all their previous living and associations. It was solved, at least partially, by the government issuing paper money, similar to the greenbacks, which carried the United States through the Civil War. These were furnished to applicants upon deposit of sworn, approved, and examined statements of their property of all kinds in England. 25% of the amount thus appearing was given, or rather loaned, to the applicant, and with this he was enabled to make a start in the new quarters he had selected. The plan involved the assumption of an enormous burden by the government and an unqualified confidence in it by the people. Of course, England was not in any sense to become a depopulated island. Its real estate values, though shrunk to slender fractions of their former worth, would yet have some value, and whereas, in the case of a manufacturer, the government made the loan upon his attested resources in machinery and certified correspondence, the risk was reduced sensibly within discoverable limits. Loss, agitation, dislocations, in many cases ruin, resulted, but the transfer of the manufacturing plants was made most skilfully, and before the factories in England were closed, the same products were being produced in Australia. The menace of the emergency had startled Englishmen into a really reasonable and adequate show of sense, quickness, and resource. Usually poor businessmen, torpid and conservative, shackled with a kind of mild and traditional laziness, they became, under the stimulation of the danger of extinction, active and wary and intensive. In the meanwhile, the climatic changes continued, and the face of the United Kingdom more and more altered under the infliction of the long and tempestuous winters, the cool, shortened summers, and the ice blockade about its coasts. For it had early become apparent that, in some inexplicable way, the Arctic currents streamed down from the polar regions with reinforced volume and velocity, bringing with them the discharged masses of ice projected from their usual course westward by their eruption into the Arctic Ocean through the Bering Straits of the united oceanic rivers of the Gulf Stream and the currents from the Yellow Sea. Throughout the spring the beleaguered coasts were deeply fringed with ice floes and icebergs, whose chilling emanations created fogs and wrapped the islands in cheerless cold. Each passing year had made more clear the surpassing wisdom of the evacuation, but a large population found that they could support themselves on the island, made up of the hardy, enduring types, the sailors, fishermen, and the boreal agriculturalists, the farmer who entertains life successfully where the earth reluctantly yields her products, and the scant nature furnishes but few of the products of the soil. For now, a most extraordinary thing happened. The refrigeration of northern Europe had driven down towards the south the northern denizens. They eagerly seized the deserted land of the southerners, less accustomed to the niggardly responses of the field, and met the attacks of the climate with the accustomed patience and resistance to which they had become inured in their northern home. In this way the population of Iceland almost bodily left the bleak and ice-bound coasts of the Arctic island that no longer offered the meagre semblance even of subsistence which previously maintained its stubborn, hardy occupants. Nothing could have been more fortunate, as it retarded in some measure the shocking decline in the values of the land, and gave to all establishments that might otherwise have been turned into homes for owls and foxes a partial usefulness. Not indeed that the manufacturing interests would be considerably revived, but warehouses and buildings connected with manufacturing or shipping business would be made into storehouses, and the castles and large manor houses were converted into curious communal colonies, where those boreal people most joyfully repaired and developed profitable communities. Large numbers of the very poor found in the exodus of the well-paid or employed classes above them a grand chance to renew their own luck. They became keepers of the deserted buildings. They fraternized with the newcomers, and, freed from the incubus of a superimposed social repression, became happy and industrious. To all the brands and grades of the surviving or deserted inhabitants came increasing numbers of Scandinavians. Important fractions of the Scotch settled on the coasts of England, and even immigrants from Newfoundland and Canada were tempted to seize the strange opportunity to occupy vast and abandoned cities, which furnished them in many instances with palatial shelters, but which later became repellent and unpleasant abodes, from which they too willingly withdrew to the smaller settlements. The tragedy of the big cities was complete. They were melancholy wastes. Their empty streets seemed baleful and dismal. They gave ghostly thrills of terror even in the noonday to the passers-by. Silent graves of past memories, the speechless, vacant, staring windows in the unlit rooms were like the open but expressionless eyes of corpses, and the awful fall of silence through the labyrinth of ways, roads, lanes, places, squares, alleys, descended upon the wanderer, caught by some malign trick of adventure within their voiceless, motionless depths, with the benumbing touch of the grave. He hastened his steps. He ran to escape the deadly stupor, the inexpressible gloom of loneliness, where every aspect betokened life. The solitude of nature inspires, draws to the lips an involuntary prayer, or places in the heart the movements of hope. But this hideous contradiction of signs and effect weighed like lead upon the spirit and forced from the shrinking heart the ejaculations of despair. Never on earth was there such a picture of dejected grandeur as this emptied metropolis of the world presented. Never before had a great city become its own tomb through the flight of its inhabitants. Never in any record of disaster, whether by earthquake, pestilence, flood, or volcanism, was there such obliteration as followed the withdrawal of the citizens of London from their own capital. The thick blanket of the snow was thrown over it in winter, and its emergent domes, pinnacles, obelisks, and needles offered a fantastic similitude to mortuary monuments, or else, beneath the yellow moon, its piercing whiteness, like a titanic face of someone killed, smote the blue-black skies above it with remorse. But in Australia the English strength revived and broadened. It promised to make a gigantic social revolution. It worked, strangely enough, in unison with the newly awakened hopes of the king to restore an accustomed prestige to the crown. This political phenomenon attracted the attention of the civilized world. The king, in a most adroit proclamation to the people, had peculiarly enlisted their sympathy by his veiled complaint of the habitual loss of power and the encroachments upon the kingly prerogatives of the self-constituted cabinet of ministers. The king's action was always tacitly prescribed and anticipated. He was a puppet, dressed in regalia, with no shadow of power, real and personal. And this he resented, but his language was the sentences of diplomacy, and lost the individual note entirely in a concerned and measured argument, restrained by every possible regard for the present custom, urging a greater confidence in the king's wishes, and a larger precinct of action for his judgment. This momentous promulgation was contemptuously referred to by its critics as the Ourselves letter, but it met a favourable reception, and it enlisted the cordial endorsement of the House of Lords. Nor was it altogether resented by the House of Commons. The achievement of this success led the king into a further step of interference in the appointments and in the personnel of the cabinet, and he succeeded further in impressing his wishes upon a number of important bills passing through the Parliament. In short, by a persistent pressure seconded by friends among the people and a growing following in the legislature, he had inserted his views and extorted from the grudging concessions of the Commons recognition of the royal prerogatives. He had shown himself unusually active in resource, in suggestions, and in intercourse with the people. His examples had been followed with enthusiasm by the nobility, who, so to speak, spread themselves before the observation of the nation, and exerted an unaccustomed generosity and ubiquitous energy in practically assisting the work of rehabilitation. At a general election, many candidates were discussed and elected upon this issue, viz., the restoration to the king of kingly power. And so, you see, Thomson concluded, the unexpected happens as it always does. We moved to an ultra-democratic milieu, a veritable nest of fads and socialist temerities and experiments. And lo, the reaction sets in, and in Australia the king may recover the power, lost with the Stuarts, and the monarchical principle gets a shove ahead, which, with prosperity, and in England, no impulse short of the fiat of the Almighty could have secured for it. A prophet who would have foretold that would have scored a poor success in 1900 as a state-maker. Before he had finished speaking, Leacraft had left his chair and was walking to and fro near the speaker, and then he advanced to the edge of the few steps that led from the piazza to the open swards beneath them, which were fringed by an emergent crown of trees growing thickly in some lower crease or hollow of the ground, beyond which again the eye fell to the footswells and the undulations of land far off in the flats, just beginning to twinkle with lights. Leacraft spoke slowly, his eyes still fixed upon the distance, as if in reverie, but his measured words came clearly to his two friends, carried by a voice which, always melodious and cultured, now gained a sort of passionate yearning, and then again was approved as disinterestedly clean and judicial. All this is an episode, nothing more. The future of the races of the world means the widening scope of the Republican idea. There can be no other. Education forbids its extinction, yes, and authority endorses it. This sudden foolishness in Australia will only invoke a perilous reaction. There can be today in governmental systems only varied applications of the one thought, the rule of the people, through an appeal to the people's choice of rulers. It is fundamentally common sense in an era of enlightenment to begin with, but since the United States have eclipsed all nations and raised the standards of individual action beyond all previous estimates, this conclusion has coercively been accepted, that through the influences propagated under this popular freedom of control, the finest, the richest, the sweetest, the most magnanimous types of character are also engendered and completed. A kind of psychological logic is involved. A vast psychic power of selection sets in, and irrevocably the most noble, the most disenthralled natures slowly appear. In comparison with their best results, the representatives of other cultures appear dwindling and abortive. And why? Because in the least limited field of opportunity, the unrestrained power of nature to make character must of necessity evolve consummate and supreme examples. Nothing is more demonstrable. It must be conceded, I grant, that at first the crop of temperaments is marked more by rash hardihood, strident vulgarities, and climbing audacity. But these very qualities, which in the naming seem so distasteful, mature naturally in later generations into devoted courage, aesthetic spontaneity. Juices of the fruit, when green, form the basis of its later richness. I know the tiresome and hackneyed nonsense and the mean-spirited sneers of the European at the American for his lack of culture, his defect in polish, his money-getting haste. And it's all a lie. Leacraft wheeled round as if on a pivot, and even in the pale light the Thompsons could see that his face flushed, and the stern decision of his voice betrayed the fires of resentment. Who is it that these precious pretenders of Europe look to when they have famine and disaster? Who has taught the lessons of sympathy, of open-hearted helpfulness and unswerving generosity, or made them recognize in their own natures the almost exterminated seeds of kindness? As to culture, let me tell you in all seriousness that the idle glamour of a scholar's diction does not weigh a barleycorn as against the flashing splendor of an honest and sincere spirit. As to polish, who made the European regard woman as something better than the helpless ally of his lust and the chained companion to his exultant vanity? Woman has gained a new empire of dignity in these new lands. She for once triumphs in the unquenched assertion of her rights. As to money-making greed, where under the canopy will you find a more meanly mercenary race than these same Europeans, inert panderers to pleasure from money, fortune hunters and silent spectators of atrocities if the risk of money loss stops their way to succour? I know the dolts and traitors on the American soil, the men and women who sell their birthright for the mess of pottage contained in a gilded name in Europe, or the hollow mockery of a coat of arms. These are the tattooed children of humbug, careless and ungrateful, indolent and self-seeking, lured by that strange beauty which Europe, for some inscrutable reason, seems to keep, and of which even I, as an Englishman, feel jealous for the sake of a country which may not be so good-looking, but which becomes every day more sublimely the appointed pattern of the future state. Well, my friends, You must pardon these wild and whirling words. They may strike you as an unseemly tirade, but if you knew this land as well as I do, you too might trespass beyond the limits of moderation in its defense. But other matters have for you a less doubtful interest. The great physical revolution which has left its mark no less in the political world than in the material has become consolidated and solidified into a permanent feature of the earth. The broad engulfment of the land at the isthmus has established an open way to the Pacific from the Atlantic, and the initial formation of the barrier northward from the Caribbean Sea by the erection of a ridge from Cuba to Yucatan and partially from Jamaica to Honduras. This latter connection, the singular sequel to the disturbance which overwhelmed Kingston in 1907, has advanced far enough to effectually assist the momentous deflection of the Gulf Stream from the Atlantic. And another transformation has thereby been achieved. The alien mass of hot water pouring into the Pacific at the isthmus, when no longer propelled by the easterly winds, resumes its original impetus of rotary direction, and streams sweeping northward along the coasts of California, Oregon, and Washington, bringing in its further extension warmth to British America and Alaska. By this amelioration of its climate, Alaska has specifically profited. Its numerous mineral resources have been more exhaustively explored, and the wealth of its boundless areas promises returns beyond the wildest dreams of avarice. The convulsions which were so dismally foretold in the social and political fabric of this country never occurred. They were quite lost sight of in the wonderful happenings of the world, and the trite aphorism that the spirit of discontent is best overcome by an appeal to the spirit of curiosity obtained an almost ludicrous illustration in the subsidence of every murmur of schism and contention, as the amazement grew over the upset of the temporalities of the world, as the earth readjusted its members for another, let us hope, long and uneventful slumber. For myself, perhaps I should deprecate your censure by an apology. It is true, I did not follow the fortunes of my country, though with my mind I ardently canvassed and considered them. The very interests which brought me to this land were English, and my superintendence and success with them has, in a few ways, made the survival of not a few Englishmen possible at this crisis. Really, my best place of helpfulness was here. Jim has been with me and has proved invaluable. And that poor woman whom I told you about meeting in Victoria Park the night before we saw the great procession of evacuation was found by me, and now Jim is her husband. There's nothing shocking about it. Her first husband died of consumption. It was a foregone conclusion. Jim showed himself a big-hearted friend, and the girl learned to think the world of him. And when she was alone, what could have been better from any point of view than that she should have married him? And for me, Mrs. Thompson, there is peace, too." Leacraft moved to the doorway of the broad hall that divided the spacious house. He pushed it open, and as the light from the interior fell upon his face, the visitors saw the smile of an abiding happiness upon the thoughtful countenance. And Agnes Ethel Thompson uttered a prayer of thankfulness that he had found contentment. End of The Evacuation of England, The Twist in the Gulf Stream by L.P. Gratacap.